Chapter 2. Mr. Spillini. "You'll need a wizard's costume," Mandy said to James as they helped clear away the dishes. "You mean like a pointy hat and a cloak?" said James. Mandy nodded. "A cloak with things like stars and moons on it," she said. "Why don't you ask Grandma to help?" Dr. Emily said. "You know how good she is at things like that." "Oh, great," Mandy said. "I was going to talk to her about my costume anyway. Let's go now, James." Dr. Adams stacked a pile of plates in the sink. "See if you can come up with a spell that makes dishes wash themselves, James," he said. Mandy grinned. "Is that a hint for us to help with the dishes?" she asked. Dr. Emily turned the water on. "No, it isn't," she said. "Off you go." "Come on, Blackie," Mandy said. Blackie leaped up and galloped to the door. "Abracadabra," Dr. James said to the pile of plates, waving the scrub brush. Mandy laughed and shot out the door with James and Blackie. "See you later," she called back. Mandy's grandma and grandpa lived at Lilac Cottage, not too far from Animal Ark. Mandy and James passed Hobart's Corner on the way. Mandy looked through the gates at the house as they passed. The windows and the fresh white paint shone in the evening light. The garden was full of flowers, and the grass had been newly mowed. "Hobart's Corner is really looking great now," she said. James nodded. "I always thought it looked spooky," he admitted, "but only because it was empty for so long." Jack Gardner and his parents had moved into the house at Hobart's Corner 2 months ago. They were turning it into a guest house. Jack was 7 and had a pet rabbit named Hoppy. "I wonder how Hoppy is," Mandy said. "We could go and visit him," said James. Mandy shook her head. "Maybe later. Let's see about your costume first." They found Grandma and Grandpa in the back garden of Lilac Cottage. Grandpa was working in his vegetable patch, and Grandma was picking strawberries. Mandy's grandpa was a champion vegetable grower. "Hi, Grandma! Hi, Grandpa!" Mandy called as she and James came through the gate. Grandpa looked up at Blackie as he bounded over to him. "Hello, young fellow," Grandpa said, giving Blackie a pat. "You two are just in time," Grandma said to Mandy and James. "Come and help me pick some strawberries." Mandy and James grinned, their favorite task. "3 for the basket and 1 for the picker," Mandy said. Grandma smiled. "That's the best way to pick them." Mandy and James took a basket each from the garage and started picking. "Grandma," said Mandy, "James and I wanted to ask you a favor." "Oh," said Grandpa, "you found a stray puppy and you want us to take it in." Mandy looked at Blackie. The Labrador was lying contentedly on the ground while Grandpa tickled his tummy. "No," she said. "We want Grandma to make a costume for James, please, and one for me if she's got time." Mandy explained all about the play, while she and James and Grandma worked their way down the row of strawberries. The fruit smelled sweet. Mandy finished explaining and popped a plump, juicy fruit into her mouth. "Mmm," she said. "These are delicious." "Let's go inside, and you can have a bowl of them with some cream," Grandma said. "Your costume should be easy enough, Mandy. A tunic would do, but we should try out some designs for James's costume." "So you'll do it?" said James. Grandma smiled. "I'd love to make a wizard's costume," she said. "And I'd love some strawberries and cream," Grandpa said, leaning on his hoe. "Gardening is hard work." Mandy laughed as they all trooped inside. Grandma got some paper and pencils, and they all sat around the kitchen table with their bowls of fruit discussing James's costume. "That was great," said Mandy, scooping up the last of the cream with her spoon. "And just look at the design for my costume," James said. Mandy looked at the sheet of paper in front of Grandma. She had drawn a long, flowing cloak covered with stars and moons. "I'll use some silver paper for the decorations," Grandma said, "and plenty of sequins." "I'll make you a long black mustache, James," said Grandpa. "It'll make you look mysterious." "And we'll need a hat," said Mandy. "James and I can make one from black oak tag and stick some more sequins on it." "Now, about your costume, Mandy," Grandma said. "What exactly do you have to do in the play? Do you need to be able to run around?" Mandy grinned. "Oh, yes, I'm the wizard's apprentice," she said. "I've got to set the bravest dog in the village on Horrible Horace to save my master." "Guess who the dog is," said James. "Don't tell us. Blackie?" said Grandpa. James nodded. "Mrs. Garvey asked for him specifically." Blackie looked up and gave a short bark. "The only trouble would be training him to stop chasing Andrew Pearson," Mandy said, giving Blackie's ear a rub. "Blackie has got to get the wizard's wand back when Horrible Horace steals it," said James. "It's a very important part in the play. The wizard is powerless without his wand." "We're going to try and include all the pets we can," said Mandy. "It's going to be wonderful." "Jill Redford is going to bring Toto, her tortoise," said James. "And then there's Duchess, Richard Tanner's Persian cat," said Mandy. "And Laura Baker's rabbits," said James. "And Amy Fenton is going to do some gymnastics. She's really excited." "Amy was upset that Minnie can't have a part," Mandy explained, "but Mrs. Garvey couldn't see how we could fit a mouse into the story." "That's why Amy is doing some gymnastics instead," James said. "Is Jack Gardner's rabbit Hoppy going to be in the play?" Grandma asked. James nodded. "Mm-hmm. We're going to go and see Jack on the way home," he said. "And Hoppy," Mandy added. "Don't get in the way," Grandma said. "Mrs. Gardner's expecting her very first paying guest today. She's really excited. She wants everything to be just right. They've worked so hard getting Hobart's corner fixed up." "We won't get in the way," said Mandy, getting up from the table. "Thanks for the strawberries, Grandma." "And for agreeing to make the costume and the mustache," said James. "Come on, Blackie," Mandy said. "Let's go and see if Mrs. Gardner's paying guest has brought a pet." Mandy and James found Jack playing with Hoppy in the garden at Hobart's corner. The black and white rabbit looked up at them with his bright black eyes. He wasn't at all afraid of Mandy and James. He knew them very well. "Hi, Hoppy," Mandy said, tickling the little animal behind the ears. Hoppy sat up on his hind legs and began to wash his whiskers. Jack held out a lettuce leaf, and Hoppy sniffed at it, then nibbled delicately. "He's getting so big," Mandy said. Jack stretched out a hand and stroked his rabbit. "Laura says he's even bigger than Patch," he said. Laura Baker had 3 rabbits, Nibbles, Fluffy, and Patch. Patch was from the same litter as Hoppy. Jack didn't want a pet when he first came to Welford, but as soon as he saw Fluffy's babies being born, he fell in love with them. So Laura had asked him if he wanted one, and Jack had chosen Hoppy. "Grandma says you're getting your first paying guest," said Mandy. "Do you know who it is?" Jack shook his head. "He should be arriving any time. I'm watching for him. Mom says his name is Mr. Spallini, but she doesn't know anything else about him." "What an odd name," said James. Mandy heard a car pull up at the gate and turned quickly. "It's a taxi," said James. "It must be him." Mandy, James, and Jack watched as the taxi turned into the driveway and stopped at the front door. "Can you see him?" asked Jack. "Wait a minute, he's getting out," Mandy said. They watched as a tall, thin man stepped out of the taxi. He stood for a moment, looking around the garden. Mandy drew in her breath. He looked extraordinary. He was wearing a long black cape, and he had a top hat on. Mandy could see he had very dark eyes and a pointed black beard. He was carrying what looked like 2 big covered boxes with handles on top. He put them down very carefully on the front steps of the house. "Wow," James gulped. "Look at those clothes." "They are strange," said Mandy. "I wonder what's in the boxes." Jack's eyes were large, round saucers. Mr. Spallini walked to the back of the taxi as the driver opened the trunk. He reached in and lifted out a big black trunk. He put the trunk on the ground and the taxi drove off. Then he looked around the garden and saw them. Mandy felt her eyes popping as he swept off his top hat and bowed to them. His cape swirled about him. Then he turned and disappeared into the house. "Wow," said James. "Who do you think that he is?" Mandy was looking at the trunk. It was very big and very black, and it had a huge lock on it. "And what do you think is in the trunk?" she asked. "I don't know," said James, "but I've never seen anybody like Mr. Spallini before."